This conference will now be recorded.
All right, you're good to go.
Okay, as I said, this is a neighborhood roundtable meeting. First item on the agenda is to get the minutes from the last meeting approved. Ed has emailed those out. If you have looked at them, please, well, if you haven't looked at them, please do so. And if you have looked at them, I need a motion for approval of the minutes.
So moved.
Is there a second to that?
Second.
Any? That works for me. Motion has been made and seconded to approve the minutes from the last meeting. All in favor, say aye if you want to.
Aye.
Anybody opposed, say aye. Motion carries. All right. Now I gotta want my phone to check the rest of the agenda. Next thing I have on the agenda is the City of Kansas City Health Department with Frank Thompson. Are you there, Frank? Don't see Frank on my list of people.
I don't either. I thought maybe caller 3 was it, but well, let's talk a little bit about what topics we might want to talk about going forward. Maybe he'll join us here in just a minute. I will email him and see if I can't reach him.
Anything you'd like to hear about, Claudia?
I am interested in the B&B thing on today's agenda.
Well, hopefully that speaker will show up at 2:30 when scheduled.
Yes.
2:30. What would we like to talk about? It's really a North Oak question, but any further word about the car lot guy? At the old bank building?
Is that?
I haven't.
Go ahead, Ed.
Well, I've written a letter to the owner advising them of the ordinance that says you can't have a used car lot on a parkway. But that's it. That's about all I know.
Well, there's no ordinance that bans a used car lot on a parkway, but it's in the park department plans that they would not allow one. The park department will not approve it. And from what I'm hearing, the park department is standing by that. However, I
Correct.
don't think that keeps him from making quote unquote improvements. If you see any cars starting to be parked there or whatever, let us know because we'll need to get right on it. I'm hoping that he doesn't think I'll just start parking there and I dare them to stop me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was just going to say something I've noticed. For the number of people we have here, with most of them with the microphones on, the sound is coming through much better than it usually does in some of the past meetings. So compliments to whoever made the change. It's working better.
I have a question. Have any of the neighborhoods represented here had the city develop a park in your neighborhood?
You mean a newly developed park?
Well, since you became a neighborhood or I'm in a private HOA
Okay.
and we're looking to develop a park. And one option, if we can get some PIAC funds, is to ask for the city to take on the park. And our board is really debating that right now. And I just wondered if anyone out there had any experience with that.
We've made requests for improvements to our neighborhood park, but the neighborhood park has actually been here longer than I have, and that's 40 years plus. So I don't know how you would go about starting one and getting the Parks Department to take it over. I think
Well,
they've got like
they-
221 now. So
They told me that if we would apply for the PIAC funds, if we were awarded those, we could request that they do that. They did say that their maintenance budget was really tight, and she didn't know if they would accept it or not. And I guess my question is, if the city does develop it, do you have control over the design of the park, or how that all works?
to answer the question about it, in our neighborhood, Cooley Park, before the Parks Department or the city or anyone else would do anything, we had to apply for PIAC funding to make a master plan for the park,
Right.
and then reapply after the master plan was designed for funds to implement parts of the park.
Mm-hmm.
And as there is a lot of competition for those dollars, it can be a time-consuming process and can take a number of years to get
Yes,
anything major done to the park.
I understand that. Yeah. But they go along with your master plan normally.
Not working with the park department already, I would suggest you have somebody out to a neighborhood meeting, because they'll want to.
We have done that, and we have been started working with them.
Great. Was everybody still doing the social distancing and staying home?
No, I just pulled into work.
I got a comment on that one.
Yeah.
Last night I went to the meeting that Heather and Kevin O'Neill had at Nikki's Pizza Place. Nobody was social distancing. All the employees were wearing masks and gloves and that kind of thing, but the people attending were not.
I've noticed that too, like at the grocery store.
Are the council people masked?
No. Dan Fowler was also there, and none of the three were wearing a mask.
Well, they may be in the same situation I'm in, and that is I had it, and I'm recovered from it, and I'm immune from it, and it's far enough out I'm not contagious.
Hopefully you're immune to it. From what I've seen, there have been a number of cases where people have come down with it twice. So
I haven't heard that.
They had it. One of the specific examples I can think of was a Navy person on one of the ships. He was tested, was positive, recovered, tested negative a couple of times, and then tested positive again. So
yeah, maybe it lingered. I mean, it was a month-long process. It was not a fun February. I'm going to tell you that.
Well, personally, I would advise that you mask and avoid close proximity with people if you can help it.
I'm
What are
leaning
other,
that way.
excuse me?
I'm leaning that way also.
I'm more than leaning.
Last night was the first time I went to something where they didn't, and I won't be repeating it that way, at least not in the near future.
What do others think?
We're with you, Deb. We're doing the same thing as much as we can. It's really difficult always to social distance because it's breaking a habit, But yeah, we're wearing masks and staying apart.
It is, we're social people. I mean, that's just part of what we are, social beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Until we can get through this a little further, and the numbers, I think we owe it to not only ourselves, but those we're around.
Yeah, I agree.
I'll give you an example of how much I'm going out. In the last 4 months, I've put 2 tanks of gas in my car. Most of that's just to go to doctor appointments and the grocery store, occasionally over to my daughter's house.
Something that I read recently from Dr. Rex Archer, he commented that Missouri is reopening and a lot of people are feeling pandemic fatigue, so they're not adhering to social distancing guidelines. And so it's actually more dangerous right now to be going out than it was at the beginning of the pandemic lockdown. And I think that's advice we should all take very seriously.
I would agree.
Well, after Memorial Day, we're starting to see the results of that in the statistics. So, yeah.
Also, Texas and a couple other states that reopened earlier than the rest have noticed a dramatic rise in the number of cases. Now, whether that's because they have more cases or because they're doing more testing, I couldn't say, but they definitely have more numbers.
Well,
yeah, definitely testing plays a role.
I read that the new cases far outnumber the increase in testing.
They say the best measure is to count hospitalizations.
Yeah, that's the key. That's the key, is the number of people requiring hospitalization. Well, I do have to get into work, so I'm gonna have to hang up. I did want to let you all know there was a little snafu on the Nextdoor app. I don't know if you guys saw it. Someone posted about our dumpster day this coming Saturday to the entire Nextdoor community, not just to our neighborhood. So I don't know what kind of turnout we're going to have, but hopefully I'll have a lot more volunteers for that. But we're going forward with that, and people in the neighborhood are ready to discard those things they cleaned out while they were locked down. So
that's a danger of Nextdoors, because they can get spread further than just your neighborhood.
Well, she posted it to the entire Nextdoor community, not just to the neighborhood. She took it down, but it was up for like 16 hours. And I'm like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? But luckily, Officer Lentz is gonna be there. And so he will help direct traffic if we have an issue. And then we're gonna check IDs. So, well, I will look for the recording. Hello. So,
I suggest that you have a sign up at the entrance to your cleanup that says your neighborhood only. Maybe before people get all the way in, they'll get the hint they shouldn't be there.
Good idea.
Yeah, maybe. So, all right. We will talk to you guys next month.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Mary.
Officers, what do you have going on? Officer Jones, Officer Len?
Guess I could unmute myself here. So last night, what we had so far this week was last night we did our. Okay, I just want to make sure I'm not echoing here. Last night, Ed and I, we did the what I believe is the first virtual crime watch training with the Brookfield neighborhood. Very well attended. Ed, we had close to 25 households. Is that on here?
Yeah, I'm on here.
Very, very interactive, very productive meeting. I was worried about it because it's, I think a lot of you have seen me present. Some of you probably sat through the Crime Watch training, and it's there's a lot of visual components to it, some interactive components as well. And I was kind of concerned how it was going to go, but I think it went pretty well. It's nothing like having a one-on-one meeting, but we at the end of the day we were able to accomplish pretty much the same thing we wanted to accomplish. So I'm looking forward to the next one. Ed and I kind of sat down, hammered a few things out, and I'm ready to see how they flow, quite frankly. So I'm pretty excited about it.
Hey, Rick, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would just like to throw in there is kind of a climate being created right now. I don't think, and I'll just speak for myself, I certainly don't support some of the things that I've seen. What happened in Minneapolis, it's hard to even think anybody will have any excuse for it. But we know that's not you guys. We know we've not seen that out of KCPD, and you've got my support 1,000%. I think you've got a really tough job right now, and you have to feel like it is pretty thankless. So keep up the good work. Let us know how we can partner. Join us when we're outraged with things like what happened in Minneapolis, but know that I'm there for you.
Thank you, Deb.
Appreciate
Sorry, definitely appreciate that.
And I was just gonna say, it's ever since all this has happened, I have a couple off-duty jobs in various parts of the city, and Deb, what you said, I've probably heard that all over the city, almost nonstop since all this has happened, and you definitely echo the sentiments, I would say, of probably 90% of the community or more. So it's just remember that. Just keep that in mind. It's everybody like-minded like us. They appreciate what we do, and quite frankly, not to go too much into it, but I think we're all outraged over the same things as well. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yep. So to answer your question, Deb, well, first, thank you very much. The support is always good to have. It's great to be reminded that it's out there. The media makes it seem as though the small percentage of the population is the norm. And when I'm reminded all day by folks that it's not the norm, it's reassuring. So I've spent a lot of time on social media. I spent a lot of time on Nextdoor. If you're on the North Patrol side, you've seen some of the posts that I've done, some of the work that I've done. I've created a reoccurring post called Cop Talk, and the purpose of it is to try to explain KCPD policies specifically and law enforcement policies, national law enforcement policies in general. And I'll pick a specific topic and I'll write about that topic in detail. For example, recently the media has just gotten this debate over chokeholds terribly wrong, and I tried to clear up some of the confusion for the residents of North Patrol. If those posts are something you'd really like to see on the Shoal Creek side, I can forward them along as well. But I've spent a lot of time on social media, and in one sense, it's exhausting because folks have a lot of questions, and I like constructive questions. I like constructive dialogue. I've learned some things. I've gotten to listen to some of the perceptions that folks have, and it's enabled me to sit back and think, and I have grown from that thought process that I dedicated to those perceptions. I think the police department sometimes does not work hard enough at understanding the perceptions of the people that we interact with. And I'm as much to blame for that as any of us are. I can remember as a young officer when my goal was more towards enforcement and less towards dialogue and community interaction. There were lots of enforcement interactions that I had that I walked away from, where I certainly could have articulated the why behind what I did a lot more thoroughly. And although the person may have been charged with a crime, they and their family and their sphere of influence could have benefited from my articulation had I devoted a little bit more time. So I recognize that we as an agency can grow there. That's my opinion. I think my opinion is shared by many within our organization. But anyhow, this has kept me specifically very busy, and the phone has continued to ring. The emails have continued to come in. Unfortunately, a lot of the neighborhood complaints have stacked up. I keep a log here of them, and I'm behind. As the phone rings, I log neighborhood complaints, and I need to dedicate a day and then go out and handle some issues in the neighborhood.
Somebody,
but, I'll take any questions if anybody has any.
Somebody hitting reply all to your email doesn't help, I'm sure. So I apologize again for that. I was just kind of wondering, I've been hearing the city talk a little bit about a $10 million budget reduction for the police department. Is that something that could impact us dramatically up here in the Northland, or?
It could. So here's what sparked that. It has nothing to do with the protest or the riot. It has to do with a loss of revenues. And when I pause here at the end, I'm sure Deb can fill in a lot of blanks that are beyond my knowledge base. But there's been a loss of revenue due to COVID, and the city manager has asked all departments of the city, all city departments, to go through an exercise of creating a 4.5% cut to their budget.
Wow.
And getting back to the city with that, not experimental budget, but that in theory budget. The theoretical budget with 4.5% cut, what would that look like? So the police department was asked to do that also, along with all city departments. So for the police department to cut 4.5% out of not next year's budget, but this current budget that we're in right now, was approximately $10.6 to $10.8 million. So the police department's budget is 97 or 98% salary based. So in order for us to cut a budget this year without any warning, the only way to do that, according to the presentation given by the chief and the deputy chief of the fiscal division yesterday at the Board of Police Commissioners meeting, was to cut manpower. So the police department looked at this over the last week or so, and they came up with two test theories that they're going to present to the city as options. And one of the two options was, well, basically they had to cut manpower. That's the only way to impact 10.6 million. But the two options were to cut from the entire department equally. So if there's 6 patrol division stations, each patrol division station would be reduced by X amount. And option 2 would be to cut an entire division station, like Center Patrol Division, for example. Instead of having 6 division stations, we would close the station and have 5. And there's a lot of nuance to this, and that's where I think Deb would probably be able to speak a lot more articulately than I. But in order to cut folks, we've already canceled the academy classes. We're not hiring any police officers the rest of this year. The classes have all been canceled. which is very unfortunate because we just spent 3 years recruiting heavily, trying to get back up to neutral. And the work that we've done the last 3 years is now going to be erased because we're not going to hire for the rest of the year. So our numbers are going to fall backwards, and we're going to be in a position to where we're playing catch up again. And it's going to take a couple to several years out into the future again to get back caught up. In addition to not hiring any new officers the rest of the year, in order to meet that $10.6 million reduction, things are being considered like layoffs and furloughs. Early retirements came up, but that's not really a good option. It's a false option, if you will. They were talking about incentivizing retirements, which when you look at the math, that does not help us this budget year. It will help us next budget year because you get those top heavy folks to move along. But this budget year does not help us because when those top heavy folks retire, they take with them payouts for their sick time and unused vacation time. So this budget year would actually be a net loss in monies. So I'm going to pause there, and Deb, please feel free. I'm sure there's nuances about politicking and monies that I don't understand.
It's real easy to understand in that the city has one pot of money, and there's a limited number of dollars in it. When I did the budget 10 years ago, public safety was about 60% of the overall budget. In those 10 years, public safety also includes fire department and ambulance. When they were doing the budget this year, to be honest, I was just aghast that public safety is now 76% of the city's budget. If public safety doesn't take a cut, where does it come from? Unfortunately, through the years, as the percentage for public safety has increased, we don't have as much money for dangerous buildings. We don't have as much money for codes enforcement, infrastructure, all of those things, which are also important to safe, livable neighborhoods. Now, I know Chief Smith, I know the police department. They need to just have that conversation, and it's going to be painful for everyone, but everyone's got to figure out a way to give and make it through this rough patch. I think everyone, I just stated how supportive I am of the police department, and I am, very much so. But they're going to have to find a way to have it fit. But to pretend when and the police aren't saying this, but we did have some departments when I went through it, because I was the budget chair during 07, 08, and 09 when the economy was so terrible. When you have one department say, yeah, I'm not cutting, it cuts into another department deeper. And I don't think we're in the position where we can do that either. I'd be glad to be of assistance, and certainly offer my support. But I think that we have to have reasonable people sit around the table and figure out how we protect Kansas Cityans, provide the best basic service possible, and move forward. But it's a tough one thing, and I'm just going to throw my political opinion, and somebody could throw something at me. This seems to have brought up what's going on right now, all kinds of peripheral issues, local control. Personally, I am opposed to what they're calling local patrol or local control. When I was down there, my comment back to anyone who brought it up is, tell me how Kansas Cityans will be safer. And no one can give you one example how Kansas Cityans will be safer. It just changes the power dynamic a little bit. And I understand we're one of the only police departments, or maybe the only police department in the nation, that is under the model we're under, the management model. However, I think if you also look, we're one of the few large police departments that have not had major issues. We're not under any kind of consent decree. Not that we don't have our share of issues, but we have really escaped the big controversial issues. So I think instead of, to me, calling it local control, no, there's an extra layer of control, and it's called the state. The city has the power of the purse, how much money we give the police department. I found when I was there that was a really big hammer. But I think they've done a great job. When I was listening to one of the television interviews, and someone was giving advice what police departments need to do to avoid the things like we saw in Minneapolis. I sat through the shooter training or whatever they call it, and as I sat there and listened to them, they said, well, number one, they need to do this. And I thought, well, KCPD already does that. They need to do this. KCPD already does that. And I do think maybe KCPD needs to blow their horn a little louder. Maybe we need to be a little more transparent about what some of those. I don't think anyone's trying not to talk about it. To be honest, I don't know that there's interest until we have issues pop up like they have recently. But everything that they were advising, I thought KCPD already does that. That doesn't mean there aren't issues, but I do think that they're addressed in a timely, responsible way. And believe me, and I think these guys know, if I had an issue, you can believe I wouldn't be afraid to speak up. So I don't know if that answers that. We just need to have reasonable people, not turn this into a power play, and discuss honestly what's going on with the budget and how things can be addressed. Keep these guys on the street, keep basic services going. I find it a little hard to swallow, and I'm getting way too political now, but how do we do big hotels and soccer complexes if we can't do the basic stuff? So I will shut up now before I say something I'm really sorry for.
And in that case, I'm going to interrupt. I noticed is on the line now. He was scheduled to talk to us about Airbnbs from the planning department. So Joseph, chime in. We'd appreciate hearing from you.
Hi there, can you guys hear me? This is Joe, Rex Winkle.
Can hear you, Joe.
Hey, Joe, thanks for being here.
Sure. I just jumped out of another meeting, so I could use a bit of a refresher. I know there was a specific topic that Ed wanted me to touch on, and I'm just drawing a blank right now. I'm sorry.
Joseph, that's all right. Joseph, we were wanting to talk about the Airbnbs, and we brought that up at the last meeting. And remember, you and I talked about there's two phases of what the owners can go after, and I'd like to talk about that and make sure everybody understands kind of the process somebody can go through, and if they're not going through it, what they need to do.
Okay. So there's basically try to do a very high level short-term rental. So we call them short-term rentals because their Airbnb is just one of, probably 20 or 25 different platforms that someone can advertise on. But Airbnb is kind of a shorthand for it. They're very high. The ordinance regulating them is quite complicated. So I'll try to do a really high level overview of what they are. There's basically three types of short-term rentals that the ordinance contemplates or outlines. One type is if the owner or the owner's full-time tenant, like if the owner has an annual lease, for example, with a renter, is if the owner or that lessee lives in the home while they're renting it. So they call that owner occupied, but it technically doesn't have to just be owner occupied. It can be the permanent renter also living there. Those are allowed pretty much everywhere. And there is a process by which they have to notify adjacent property owners, but there is no requirement that they obtain any consent of any kind from adjacent property owners. I would say that probably 30 to 40% of the known short-term rentals in the city are that type. The second type, and there's two categories in the second type, is when the owner or permanent tenant does not live in the home, but yet rents it out for short-term rental on Airbnb or HomeAway, you name it. Those are probably the majority. The remaining 60 or so percent would fall into that category. There are two different subcategories there. There's year-round rentals, because there are some people who just want to rent seasonally. And at the time the council passed the ordinance, they decided if you want to rent it seasonally, the expectation should be, in theory, the impact is lesser on a neighborhood if they're renting it just during the summer, for example. So they have lesser standards in terms of the bar they have to meet to get approved for the seasonal rentals. The ones that are year round do have to have a higher bar, and they do have to obtain consent from the abutting property owners, from 55% of the abutting property owners, not all of them. And as long as they obtain that consent and then meet the rest of the terms of the ordinance, then staff is obligated to approve that permit. And every year thereafter, they must register with the city. But the registration is really just more for ensuring that they're aware of, they continue to consent to following the ordinance requirements and that they're aware of them. It's not really reapproval, it's just registration and updating that every year. Since the majority of short-term rentals are that we call those type 2, there's type 1, which are the owner occupied, and type 2, which are not. Since the majority fall under the type 2 category, that's where, and the impacts tend to be a little bit harsher on neighborhoods when the owner's not living in the home, but renting it out. Those are where the bulk of the code complaints, the code enforcement complaints lie, are with those. That's where the bulk of our energy is directed in terms of both enforcement and in trying to review the applications we get. So there's kind of a two-pronged approach. In terms of enforcement, when the council passed this ordinance, it was a couple of years ago now, we did ask for additional funding for staff for enforcement, and we did not receive that. So we've been operating with the same resources, trying to enforce the code complaints we got, which at this point number around 250, I believe, citywide. We think there's about 1,000 short-term rentals citywide. So about a quarter of them have a complaint on them is a good way of looking at it.
Wow.
It's very hard to enforce the ordinance because, as you know, if you've ever stayed in one, if you're staying in an Airbnb, you're probably there in the evening or overnight, but not necessarily during the day. So in order for us to determine that someone's actually used illegally, we have to determine that they're there at night. And of course we don't. That adds a difficulty in terms of enforcement. We do have fortunately we were able to retain a consultant. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, my screen froze up for a second. We were able to retain a consulting firm that does actually scrub all the various rental sites to verify whether certain properties have an active short-term rental or not. And that's been very helpful. That's our biggest tool right now with enforcement, because so many of the complaints that come in have to do with, like, they're kind of vague. They tend to be, there's too many people staying here, that it's transient in nature. But there's all sorts of, that may or may not mean it's really a short-term rental. You are allowed, any of us in the city is allowed to have a lodger, someone who's unrelated to us, that stays in our living room on occasion. And sometimes people interpret that as being a short-term rental. Bed and breakfasts are regulated differently from short-term rentals, and sometimes those are mistaken for short-term rentals. So there's a lot of nuance between how short-term rentals are regulated versus lodging versus just someone's house and there's unrelated people living in the house, versus a hotel, for example. And those can be very confusing for citizens when they know something's going on next door, but they don't know for sure if it's a short-term rental, and we have to sort through all that. Are there any specific questions about that I can answer, or any properties that people are aware of that they're having concerns with?
My understanding is there is one of these house is roughly the 4400 block of Main, North Main. And I think the police have been called several times for loud parties or something. I don't know the specifics, but I know that there is one there, and the neighbors aren't particularly happy with it.
And you, okay.
It's like Normandy and North Main, the second house from the corner on the north.
Oh, Ed, was this one of the ones we talked about
I
previously?
believe it is.
Yes, I believe that's why we asked you to come today, sir.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Bear with me just a moment. I'm looking something up.
Okay.
So that consultant that I mentioned that we work with that scrubs all the sites, they do not see do not have a record of a short-term rental at 4400 North Main. Now it's very possible that one exists, and what they, as some of you may know, like if you've ever been on, Airbnb's website or something like that, it doesn't give you a specific address when you're searching. So the best that this consultant can do is put a bunch of different records together and give a very educated guess as to what the address is. So it could be that they found something, let's say, and they gave it an address of 4402 North Main, and it's just not coming up because of that. So I know, Ed, when you and I spoke, there was one property, and perhaps this is it, where our consultant database does not reflect it, but that you're aware of an ad, like where they're advertising on Airbnb.
I sent that ad to you.
Yeah, so whenever that happens, we can work with our consultant to get it added to the database and then work from there.
Okay.
And certainly, it's worthy of filing a code case on the property if one hasn't been yet, because that way we can start investigating it, calling the action center and filing a complaint.
It's like the 4400 block. It's that specific number. It's not. It's like the second house in or something.
Oh, okay.
4404 North Main. 4404 North Main.
That sounds right.
They were advertising it.
North Creek Village has been able to avoid this problem because in our covenants and restrictions, rentals have to be a minimum of 6 months. So that's encouraged some of that.
Yeah, a lot of that was debated a few years ago when the council was considering the ordinance, and ultimately what they decided was to allow them. I'm not sure if, Ed, is there a share screen option? I'd be happy to share. It doesn't let me. It says I'm not able to.
Eli, can you help him with that?
Joseph, yeah, let me give you presenter level permissions here, and you should be able to share your screen.
Eli, you have the same job I have at City Planning Commission.
Okay, solidarity.
With running these meetings virtually, it's a fun job.
It sure is, but you have presenter permissions now, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, so this is what comes up to us for 4404 North Main. It does show a history of a short-term rental there. It does note that it's currently compliant with our ordinance because they have removed their advertising. Now, that could have occurred very recently.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that we don't investigate it. We still look into it, of course, if there's a complaint filed. But this is what we see. It says it was removed from advertising May 20th.
Okay.
Now, of course, they can re-advertise today, right? They can always push and pull things back on and off. So I'm not saying it's no longer an issue and everyone should move on from it. But certainly if it seems like they're still engaging in short-term rental just by being next door and you can see the activity, still feel free to file the complaint and we'll look into it. this is not the only source that we look into.
Okay, I appreciate
We
that.
there was an application that was supposed to go before the Plan Commission yesterday for 5617 Northeast 51st Street.
That's right.
Short-term rental. That
Mhm.
is in a old residential neighborhood. To me, it's really troubling because that is not a place that you would select because you were here on vacation, or, I mean, it's an old neighborhood, Maple Park. I would really wonder what their intent is.
Right. I think it's, and I think, Deb, that's related to, if you look at the map, I think you guys can see the map right now of the city. You can see while the ordinance applies citywide, this consultant is giving us a lot of data about where these are really located. And one of the things that was done when the ordinance was passed is the council directed staff to evaluate the data and come back to them with potential text amendments. We weren't able to get our hands on the data before the council changed hands last fall or last summer. So we're in the process now trying to analyze the data, and hopefully we'll soon be able to present. And by soon, I mean, there's a lot of, we were planning on trying to do it this summer, and then the virus and everything happened. But as soon as we can, try to present some modified ordinances to the council, because as you can see in this map, perhaps a citywide ordinance doesn't make a lot of sense. If they're really concentrated, about 800 of the 1,000 are located in the area south of the river, north of 85th, and east of 71 Highway, as you can see. So perhaps with that knowledge in mind, knowing where these actually are, we will be able to write an ordinance that better suits the issue at hand. And that would be our goal, because there's certainly some neighborhoods in the city where people are probably doing this, and you'll find that I think at the time we just didn't have the data to rebut it, but there was a lot of people testifying, that like have a house in, I don't know, Redbridge, for example, or somewhere that's kind of far out that doesn't have a lot of them. And they were testifying that this is their means of this is their only income. This is how they live. And I think the council, for reasons I understand, was kind of sympathetic to some of that argument. But now we can see how often they're actually renting and in those areas, and see what the actual demand is in those areas, and perhaps that will help guide any ordinance amendment going forward.
Is there an entertainment tax that's taken on some of those short-term rentals, or is that just for?
No, that's part of the reason that the ordinance requires registration is the hope that someday, I think the Missouri legislature has to pass a law that enables the city to collect such a tax from short-term rentals. And I think there was a hope that someday the legislature will do that, and then the registration will help us to collect that tax on an annual basis. But at this point, we're not able to collect it. One thing I would note, that the Host Compliance is this company that we work with, this consultant, that I think is interesting, and they think is interesting because they work with hundreds of cities throughout the country, is that we have one of the highest turnover rates in the country. And what that basically means is that while we might have approximately 1,000 short-term rentals at any given moment, it basically means that people dabble in it in Kansas City. There are people who decide to give it a go for a few months and then decide to stop doing it. And then, at the same time that occurs, someone else decides to give it a go and then stops doing it. So the number has stayed fairly steady around 1,000 to 1,200. It has dipped since March. There's been quite a few that have removed their ads since March, just probably due to the virus. But it was up around 1,200 before that. But that number is fairly stable, but it's not the same people, which makes enforcement an even bigger challenge, because typically by the time we're able to get out there, that we've found that some people have removed their ads. and they're no longer engaging in it. And then we do know of a few circumstances where we've done that and we've closed the case, and then come to find out, the next month they start advertising again. So that's an interesting aspect. It's challenging.
One of our challenges, though, Joe, is that we have had on this issue, but not that long ago, Codes Administration out to talk about enforcement of some of the violations. And they also flat tell us they can't do it. That they only have, at that time, they only had 2 people, and that our violations don't reach the level of being something that they're going to be able to deal with. Which is a good reason for the council not to pass things that require enforcement if we're not going to staff the departments.
I like how you're thinking. Yeah, this is one of those things that's very resource intensive for staff. A lot of the people that we have a dedicated web page regarding this. In fact, it's right here, and we even have, and this could be useful to citizens as well who are just curious whether their neighbor might be operating a short-term rental. This symbol here is actually a questionnaire. And it kind of guides people as to whether or not they're operating a short-term rental, and if so, what type it is, if you answer the questions. So despite doing all this, we've tried to make it as user-friendly as possible, but a lot of these folks, that are operating this, and I'm sure most of them are upstanding people that are trying to do the right thing. But a lot of the people that are doing this is the only time they've ever tried to apply for any kind of permit with the city. And so it takes a lot of, with all due respect to them, a lot of hand-holding on staff's part to get them to file the correct application. And there's a lot of back and forth for what should be a very simple, straightforward application process that we collect only a couple $100s on. So there's a lot of work, and I'm not trying to complain, but there's just a lot of work that goes into getting people to apply for the right thing, and then getting them approved. And that's just the approval side of it. That's not the enforcement side of it, which is even more difficult, just because of the complex nature of the ordinance and the nature of this particular use being primarily the activity associated with the use occurs in the evening or overnight.
Thank you.
Are there other questions for Joe?
Thanks for all you do, Joe. I know you're not the enemy.
We do have 5 people now, Deb. A while back we just had 2, but we have 5 now, and that has enabled us to get started on some of the enforcement. They are actively working on cases. They are trying to work on the cases that that come through us. We have an ongoing relationship with the police department on the complaints that have public safety aspects related to it. And while there are different laws that regulate the safety aspects, we do try to elevate those to the top of the list. So just know if we haven't gotten to a complaint you're familiar with, it's because we're working on based upon priority of which one needs to be shut down first.
Are there any other questions for Joe?
Thank you, Joe.
We're getting close to our hour time limit.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Joe.
Even though we didn't hear our first presentation, is there other business we need to discuss at this time?
Hello, this is Frank Thompson.
Hearing no comments.
Henry?
Yeah,
Frank Thomas is on the phone.
Oh. Actually,
hey,
okay.
Frank.
Hey there.
Yeah.
Sorry I wasn't here at the start. I was in actually a council committee meeting, and the discussion there went a lot longer than I was expecting.
Okay.
So in terms of COVID-19 and where we stand now, in terms of numbers, We're at 1,680 cases cumulative. We're continuing to get between 30 and 40 new cases reported to us every day, and currently stand at 30 deaths. For us, Kansas City, we've been real fortunate in this outbreak. We haven't experienced the kind of hospital surges and overwhelming our hospital systems that some other large cities have had. And that is largely because of the number of cases that have happened in our elderly population have been relatively low. Now, when those cases do happen, the case fatality, so the percentage of those that end up dying is much higher. But overall, our cases in the elderly population are somewhat down compared to other cities our size. I guess the big message that we're still trying to get out to people is we are not past this. Some of you may have seen the editorial from the Star talking about the fact that we are indeed in a second wave of COVID here in Kansas City. That is the case. And we are doing everything we can to keep it contained. We're doing community testing events, including there north of the river. We've done a couple there at Antioch Crossing, one in Northgate Middle School, and a couple of other sites up north. We'll continue doing that through the end of this month and through July, and probably most of August, trying to keep a handle on the number of infections and identifying those infections and getting folks into isolation so that they're not spreading the disease. Our message to the public is pretty much the same that it's been all along with this. Really avoid going out in crowds. Really only go out if you have to. If you're going to work, if you're one of those folks that are fortunate enough to be able to go back to work, even at work, make sure you're taking precautions. Wear your mask, wash your hands frequently. Don't touch your hands to your face, your eyes, your nose, your mouth, and try as much as possible to maintain social distancing. If you are in a work environment that does not allow that, for example, we've seen a couple of outbreaks in food distribution facilities where folks are essentially working shoulder to shoulder. In those, it becomes really critical for anyone who's having symptoms, or if you've been around someone who's had symptoms, to really make sure that you are separating yourself. Folks feel that temptation. I've got to get back to work, so even though I'm not feeling well, I'm gonna go in. It's hard enough to contain this with 40% of our cases being asymptomatic. But when folks who are symptomatic leave home and go out and actually expose other people, that just makes the job doubly hard. So I'm not going to share a whole lot more. I'd rather take any questions because I know the time is getting real short here.
Thank you, Frank. I'm certainly following your advice and encouraging others to do the same thing. We certainly aren't seeing it across the board, though.
Yeah, unfortunately, the masks have become a political issue. In past epidemics, people have understood the whole issue of wearing masks. It's a social contract, especially with this virus, because you wearing a mask really doesn't protect you. You wearing a mask stops you from infecting other people if you're an asymptomatic spreader. So it's a social contract. Your mask protects me. My mask protects you. And, the more we can get people to buy into that, you know, a lot of folks feel, well, I'm feeling great. I don't think I'm at high risk, so I don't need to wear a mask. You don't know if you're an asymptomatic spreader. So, you know, buy into that social contract. Wear the mask, protect the people around you, your loved ones, your coworkers, your neighbors. You know, I did a presentation a couple of weeks ago where I pulled up pictures from the 2019 flu pandemic and the 1919 flu pandemic and the 1935 Dust Bowl outbreak here in the Midwest. And there were pictures of people going about their daily lives wearing masks, and everybody, even at a football game, everybody was wearing a mask because people understood that social contract and respected that social contract then. And somehow we've gotten away from that. Hello?
Frank, is there any kind of a timeline for how long you think we should be wearing these masks? Is there any potential future when we could stop, barring somebody for this or something?
Until we get to a point where there is a vaccine and the majority of our population is vaccinated so that we create that herd immunity, this is going to keep coming back. So it's really a matter of how much are people willing to risk the well-being of those around them. And, you know, that's a risk calculation each person has to make individually. Our recommendation is going to be continue to wear the mask until, you know, we've got this thing under control. We've got a vaccine in place. Most of our population is vaccinated, so we don't have to worry about as much community spread. So it's going to be in the terms of months, not weeks.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? I want to thank Frank for coming on and talking with us. And Frank, I sent out the handout that you had to all the participants. So you guys should have an email in your box with what he talked about this during the meeting. So that should help as well.
Thank you.
If there are no further questions for Frank, thank you for being here. Is there any other business that we need to have for this neighborhood roundtable meeting? Hearing none, do I hear a motion for adjournment?
Thanks, Henry.
Thank you, Henry.
You're welcome, Deb.
Motion to adjourn.
You're welcome. I would say in that case, second.
Thank you all. Take care, Barbara. Thanks for coming. Thanks for everybody coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
This is Ed.